This morning, we welcome Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, to testify on the Department's fiscal year 2021 budget request. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today. Your department plays a vital role in both the domestic and global economy. Not only does the department oversee the federal government's ability to collect trillions in revenue and finance government operations, but you're also charged with investigating and protecting our financial system from illicit and criminal activities of both foreign and domestic adversaries. The fiscal year 2021 budget for the Department of Treasury is $15.7 billion, which is $2.6 billion above the amount we enacted in fiscal year 2020. In addition, the budget proposes a $400 million discretionary cap adjustment for IRS program integrity activities. This budget appears to request a dramatic increase in funding for the department. The vast majority of this increase, nearly $2.4 billion, can be attributed to the proposed transfer of the U.S. Secret Service from the Department of Homeland Security to the Department of Treasury. The remaining increase of $281 million over fiscal year 2020 levels is largely due to a requested $528 million increase for the IRS, which is offset by eliminating the funding for discretionary grant programs within the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund. While I am pleased that this request includes a substantial increase for the IRS, I'm disappointed that it also continues to request funds outside of the discretionary budget caps, despite it not being included in the budget agreement reached last year. In addition to zeroing out CDFI grants, the budget cuts funding for Special Inspector General for TARP by 20%, despite the continued obligation of billions of dollars for TARP programs that will continue into 2023. I am happy to see the budget continues to support Treasury's efforts to protect the integrity of America's financial system by maintaining robust funding for the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. And it boosts staffing for the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States to support the committee's expanded jurisdiction to guard against transactions that pose a national security risk. I look forward to hearing from our witness today on these and other issues facing the Department in fiscal year 2021. Before I turn to Secretary Mnuchin for his statement, I would like to recognize Mr. Graves for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the committee. Mr. Secretary, it's always good to have you back. And first, I want to thank you for your efforts in working with us last year as the administration's primary negotiator as we were able to wrap up last year's appropriations bills. We look forward to working with you the same this year in a bipartisan and bicameral way. Last time we met, the IRS was just implementing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act for the first time during that filing season. And now more than 80% of the middle-class, hardworking families across the country are now paying lower taxes. And we appreciate the work of the IRS and Treasury in helping with that implementation. I mean, businesses today have lower regulations, lower regulatory and compliance costs. That is always good and is working well through our economy, as is shown by our unemployment now at a 50-year low. And more than 6 million new jobs have been created since President Trump has taken office. And I think it's always important that we celebrate success, regardless of which party we're from, that great things are happening across our country, and we're grateful for that. Now skipping to the budget proposal, we appreciate the investments that have been made, that have been amplified through the administration in the military, on border security, and certainly some tough choices with reducing spending. As has been said many times on this committee, I think by me, maybe once or twice by the chairman, just because we can spend it doesn't mean we have to spend it. So I understand the request, though, for the Treasury Department includes some very important investments in sanctions enforcement, national security reviews, foreign investments, cybersecurity, and certainly IT infrastructure at the Internal Revenue Service. So I look forward to working with Chairman Quigley to ensure that your department has the sufficient resources necessary to accomplish the very important tasks that lie ahead. But before I close, I do want to recognize the concerns about how the coronavirus has impacted our economy. And I do appreciate the commitment of the Vice President and the coronavirus task force to keep the American people updated and informed as this situation progresses. And maybe as today, as we have a conversation, we can learn a little bit more about how we can expect the virus might impact the economy. But thanks again, Mr. Secretary, for joining us, and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Secretary Mnuchin, thank you for being here today. Without objection, your full written testimony will be entered into the record. And with that in mind, we would ask you for you to please summarize your opening statement in 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Quigley, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the subcommittee, I am pleased to be here with you today to discuss the President's 2021 budget and the Treasury Department's top priorities. I first want to note that the administration is closely monitoring the coronavirus and its effects on public health, as well as its effects on supply chain, markets, and the broader economy. The administration is coordinating with international organizations and counterparts in other countries to do everything possible to limit the spread of the virus and limit the harm. We stand ready to work closely with Congress on the emergency funding package and on any other related issues. Turning to our broader policy priorities, I am pleased to report that the President Trump's economic agenda is working. The President's 2021 budget for the Treasury Department makes clear that we continue to prioritize economic growth as well as our role in national security matters. We're requesting $12 billion for the IRS. This includes funding to implement the Taxpayers First Act and the third year of integrated business systems modernization. We continue to bring the IRS into the 21st century by updating systems, utilizing data analytics, and other technology. We're requesting a program integrity cap adjustment to reduce the tax gap with net savings of $64 billion over 10 years. We also remain very focused on improving customer service. The budget proposes increasing resources for the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. It also proposes enhanced funding for FinCEN to direct, investigate, and address financial and cyber crimes. The request includes additional funding to identify and mitigate cybersecurity vulnerabilities. Building off the $25 million provided in 2020, Treasury requests $10 million for the digitization of savings bonds information to allow individuals to verify ownership. Finally, we propose legislation to return the Secret Service to its original home at the Treasury Department. Doing so will result in efficiencies in the investigation of financial crimes and better prepare our nation to face the threats of tomorrow while allowing the Secret Service to continue to effectively perform its protective mission. I am pleased to be here with you today. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Secretary, we're going to go to questions now. This is a busy day, so you'll see members popping in and out. We try to indulge the schedules, so we'll go a little out of order and let Mr. Bishop begin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize, Mr. Secretary, I've got to leave for another hearing, but let me go directly in. I've got two lines of questioning. The first has to do with the coronavirus. On March the 2nd, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development forecast that global growth could be reduced by 0.5 percentage points or more as a result of the virus, but that U.S. growth would be only marginally lower. Tell me if you agree with that forecast, and if the effect of the economy remains limited, is our U.S. fiscal and monetary stimulus necessary? Do we have enough fiscal or monetary firepower remaining to respond adequately? And how prepared are U.S. firms to cope with disruptions to their global supply chains that are caused by the work interruptions in China and elsewhere? And does the threat to the world economy posed by the virus alter the administration's strategy on the trade war with China? And the second subject area has to do with CDFI. With regard to the budget, Treasury's budget proposal once again eliminates all of the grant programs at the CDFI fund, and you're proposing to reduce the guarantee authority for the bond guarantee program and seeking to increase the regulations for the important source of capital. How would these proposals impact the availability of capital to low-income people and communities?
Thank you for both those questions. So first, let me comment on the coronavirus. I think it's, well, first let me just say, yesterday I hosted a call of the G7 finance ministers and central bank governors, and this morning I was on a call that the IMF hosted with a much broader group. I think it's too early to be able to predict what the exact economic impact is going to be on the global economy and the U.S., although I would highlight, unlike the financial crisis, I do think this is an issue that's going to affect the next year. It's not a longer-term impact. So we are very focused on what we need to do here and what needs to be done abroad to make sure we protect the U.S. economy. In regards to monetary action, I very much support the Fed's action yesterday. I think there's no question that this will have some economic impact in the short term, particularly on industries like travel. And I think the Fed getting ahead of the curve in providing the stimulus is consistent with their dual mandate. At this point on the fiscal side, we are requesting some money in the emergency package. The situation is evolving, so even over the last week we have more information. I can tell you now as a member of the task force, I am incredibly impressed with the medical professionals we have working on this. I can tell you the priority of testing is something that is going to be rolled out very quickly, and manufacturing of testing on that front. And finally, as it relates to global supply chains, we don't yet see problems in global supply chains, although we're monitoring it very carefully. In regards to your comment on the CDFI, let me just say I acknowledge that the CDFI provides significant benefits to many communities, and to the extent this committee decides to allocate money to the CDFI, we will appropriately administer it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I want to address cybersecurity a little bit, if you don't mind. I know you're making some significant investments there, which is very, very critical. If you could help me understand, and this comes from the previous administration, you'll recall that Sony was hacked in 2014. Soon thereafter, it was determined that North Korea was behind that hack, and sanctions were imposed upon certain individuals, I guess, and companies within North Korea. Help us understand, how does that process work? Is that something that is continuing today? How do you measure success? How does that prevent future attacks? And have you noticed, or did that prevent future attacks? And I guess so I'm speaking of a policy from a previous administration, so you may not be familiar with that. But anything you could share with us on that?
Well, let me just first say that I do spend a significant component of my time looking at cybersecurity issues because Treasury is responsible for the financial infrastructure. Although DHS has overall responsibility, we are focused on financial infrastructure, and that's a very important component of the U.S. economy. So we constantly meet with the banks and other companies, and we very much support a public-private cooperation and effort. I also fully support moving the Secret Service back to Treasury because we will have better coordination on cyber crimes. And I think cybersecurity is an ongoing issue. I feel very comfortable with where we are, but this is a risk that constantly needs to be monitored, and we need to constantly invest in our own cybersecurity and working with our industry. Now, as it relates to sanctions, I think sanctions are one of the many tools. We will continue to look at bad actors that have cyber theft around the world. We recently did some sanctions, but that's just one of the many tools. We need to make sure that our infrastructure is protected, and the sanctions are just one of many tools we would use.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with you at all about our infrastructure needs protecting, and I'd be curious maybe your thoughts on what's the government's role in that. And it seems as if a lot of it shifted to the business sector, and that's why I was curious about the sanctions policy of the previous administration. If you've noticed that's had a sizable positive impact on the reduction of breach attempts on U.S. companies, and then maybe if you've noticed, how does that help a U.S. company if a sanction is enforced upon another foreign entity, how does that restore or make whole the U.S. entity? Is there any identifying of how that might work or how that assists that impacted entity here?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the Sony situation only because that was before my time, so I'm aware and have been briefed on it. But again, what I would say is we're much more focused today on both our infrastructure. So in the case of the IRS, one of the reasons we are asking for more money for modernization is part of that is cybersecurity issues. The IRS, unfortunately, as a large institution with a large amount of personal data, is attacked constantly. I'm happy to say that we've been very successful at countering those, but from my perspective, I look at that. I also look at, in the case of, as I said, the financial infrastructure, although it's not our obligation to protect it, we have to monitor it. And again, to the extent we have classified information, we work with private entities to make sure that they can protect themselves.
You referenced the IRS, and there was a successful breach into the IRS, and it was under the previous administration. And I assume a lot of that's been tightened up. Are you aware of anyone that's been prosecuted for that hack?
I'm not aware of it, but we can look into that and get back to you.
And I'm certainly not here to put you on the spot at all. We had before us the Judiciary a few days ago, and I asked them about the number of breach attempts. And I believe it was 24 million attempts last fiscal year, and they made the claim that none had been successful. But I followed up with the question of, well, how many individuals were prosecuted for attempting? And obviously the answer is likely zero. They couldn't identify. And so I'm curious if we need to, as policymakers, begin thinking about cyber policy in a different way. It seems like so much has shifted to the private sector. And yet when you look at how is somebody restored, such as Sony or a Georgia company like Equifax, who is paid or obligated to pay $700 million in fines, and yet they have no opportunity to be restored by those who actually cause the harm. Maybe you could share some with us later on today or in the future about if you have any thoughts on any policy changes we should make. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Yeah, Secretary, I want to follow up on that and relating to sanctions, particularly the sanctions that have been in place by this administration and the previous administration relating to Russian interference in the election process. It's your responsibility to follow up on this and enforce those sanctions. The question I have for you is, how is this going? Because the efforts seem to be continuing. Do you have the resources necessary to enforce these sanctions? Are we sanctioning the right people? What are we missing? DNI Coates, just before he left, said the lights are still blinking red. The threat is still there. The Russians are continuing their efforts. Your thoughts on how we're doing meeting this challenge, given the election is coming soon, and what still needs to be done?
First of all, I just want to comment, and I want to thank this committee and more broadly for the funding that we've had to TFI. So under this administration, we have increased funding for TFI. We've hired a significant number of people, and we've beefed up these efforts because, as you know, we've increased sanctions all over the world. And I probably spend close to half my time overseeing the sanctions program. So I do believe we are fully staffed and capable of doing it. I can tell you that I have personally reviewed all of the intel. I'm obviously not going to make any comments on it in this environment, but I am personally involved and get briefings every day on sanctions-related issues, on specifically Russia-related issues, and I'm not going to comment on future sanctions just as a matter of policy, but I can tell you our department is fully staffed and focused.
Given what you know, you say you have enough resources. The efforts obviously are continuing. What are we missing? Are we sanctioning the right people, or should we be sanctioning people higher to the top that are making these decisions? And I don't think that's a political question. The fact is, both administrations put these sanctions in place for a reason, and the efforts continue. All I'm suggesting is that maybe it's not working because we're sanctioning the wrong people, or we're not sanctioning enough, or the enforcement isn't strong enough, or in some manners they're overcoming these sanctions by alternative means.
Well, let me just comment that I do think we're sanctioning the right people. I'm happy to take personal responsibility. I actively oversee this area. So if there were people that I thought we should be sanctioning, we would be doing it. Now, let me just comment. Sanctions this is like a factory that we have, and there are always things that are being researched, intelligence that's being driven to us, and future things that are being worked on. So I'm not going to make any comments just as a matter of policy on future sanctions, but the answer is yes, I do think our sanctions programs work, and I do think we're sanctioning the right people, and I do believe we have proper resources.
Well, you indicate that the FY2020, the Office of Foreign Assets, received a $10 million increase in funding for the office, but the FY2021 budget requests a modest increase to hire 3 new FTE for Western Hemisphere human rights sanctions, for example. But otherwise, it remains flat funded for the proposal for 2021.
That is correct, and I don't have the historical funding. I have the 19 and 20, but since 16 and in 17 and 18, we have increased significantly the funding to these areas.
All right, I'll close this round of questions on my part by suggesting that to continue this, assuming that behavior will change based on our current efforts, is probably optimistic, and that we have to look at this from a different vein. The fact that you're involved in this, as you say, in so much of your time, your input into what else we could do, given that this isn't stopping, would be appreciated. Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Mnuchin, for being here. Well, it's tax season upon us again, and I want to chat with you about the Treasury's role in the IRS. It's my understanding that the IRS recently restarted its use of private debt collection companies to collect unpaid taxes from individuals with delinquent tax debts. Is that right? So I have an older population in my district in northeastern Pennsylvania, and the concern I have is tax scams. The Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, TICTA, reported that more than 15,000 people have fallen victim to tax scams that have lost upwards of $80 million collectively. Can you tell me what's being done to ensure that taxpayers are not falling victim to scammers pretending to be private debt collectors collecting tax money, and what safeguards are being put in place to make sure this doesn't happen?
Well, we're always concerned in the IRS with fraud more broadly, in particular with tax scams affecting taxpayers. So I can tell you that this is recently, the issue of the report has recently come to my attention. I'm actually meeting with the commissioner this week, and I already had on my agenda to raise this with the commissioner and see how we're going to address it. On the issue of private collectors, again, this is something that we will be monitoring. I've heard other concerns about this, and we will monitor this and get back to you.
Thank you for that. And one thing that occurs to me is that, you know, when you hire private collectors, they typically charge a cut of what they recover. Has the department conducted a study about whether it makes more sense to pay them their cut as opposed to hire more people to work at the IRS?
I don't believe we have, but I think that's a reasonable idea. And I would just also always say, you know, this is a complicated issue on contingency collecting. You're typically going after things that, by definition, you think you have a lower probability that you're going to get. But, you know, whether this is the government or whether these are private entities who collect debts for private companies, the contingency issue is always a complicated issue of internal versus external resources. But I think your idea is a good idea, and we'll review it and get back to you.
I appreciate that, Secretary. Also, as I'm sure you know, private debt companies are known to push for installment agreements that debtors often cannot afford. We passed the Taxpayer First Act to help protect against this. My question is, what oversight is the IRS doing to ensure that private debt collection companies are not taking advantage of taxpayers in this fashion?
Again, I would just say, as part of this whole issue, I will follow up with the IRS Commissioner. I will tell you we are working with the Commissioner on implementing the Taxpayer First Act overall, but this specific issue we'll look into and get back to you.
Okay. I'm also concerned about the fact that there is no acting IRS oversight board. Am I correct in that?
I believe that's the case. Let me just confirm that.
Seems
That's true.
Seems like if there were one, you would know about it, right?
I thought so, so that's why I was just confirming it.
I'm concerned about that. The board currently doesn't have enough members to form a quorum is the problem, and as a result, it has suspended operations. How long has that IRS Oversight Board not been operating? And if you don't know right now, you can get back to me.
I'll get back to you. I think it was the previous administration. But what I will tell you is we do bring in outside experts who assist us with technology ideas and other things. So one of the things I have encouraged the IRS to make sure we are getting best practices. I think the board had a challenged past, but again, we'll get back to you on that.
Okay. Finally, you did mention the tax gap. And of course, that's the difference between what's owed and what's collected. The gross tax gap right now stands at about $441 billion. Why has the IRS seen a 40% decline in its revenue officer staff since fiscal year 2011?
Well, let me just comment. Most of that decrease, I believe, was before we got here, okay, in regards to IRS funding. We have asked for additional IRS funding every year. I will tell you, I think the issue is less having more people on the tax gap and more investing more and more in technology. To the extent we have more electronic returns and more electronic forms and we're beginning to use artificial intelligence, I think that will be a major component of reducing the tax gap.
Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Kirkpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary, for being here. Arizona has a significant Native American population, and so my question is about CDFI assistance programs. The tribes really rely on these. They've been proven to be successful, and they provide critical financial capital to low-income communities in tribal nations and Native American communities throughout the country. These CDFIs do more than just distribute capital, though. They also provide financial education, entrepreneurship training, credit counseling, small business planning, and more. However, your budget request entirely eliminates grant program funding for CDFIs, including these critical Native American initiatives. How do you and the Trump administration justify such a dramatic reduction in CDFI funding? Was any consideration given to the kind of damage such a reduction would do to Native American communities around the country? And despite your request, is the Treasury Department generally supportive of CDFI funding? And would you oppose Congress restoring the program funding? How will Native American communities replace the services they have lost under the budget request?
I may have answered a similar question earlier, but I'll repeat it, which is, first of all, we would not object. I know there's a lot of support in Congress on a bipartisan basis in the CDFIs. I acknowledge in many communities, some of which, as you've described, these have very positive benefits. And to the extent that Congress wants to allocate money to that, the Treasury will continue to administer the programs the way we have been.
Thank you for being here. Again, thank you for your answer. I yield back.
Mr. Christ.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for scheduling this hearing. Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you for being here. Appreciate you being here and respect the work that you're doing for our country. I want to talk about Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, if I might. Certified CDFIs make billions of loans to underserved communities, including investments in small businesses, particularly women and minority-owned small businesses, affordable housing, and home loans, as you know. I want to discuss the small dollar loan program for a minute. As you know, Congress allocated $5 million for the small dollar loan program through fiscal year 21. Because this program has never been funded, setting it up and administering it will require additional administrative support. While I understand that the budget request proposes decimating the agency, I am hopeful that this subcommittee, under the leadership of our great chairman from Chicago, will continue its strong commitment to the CDFI fund. In this likely outcome, what additional administrative resources, sir, will the CDFI fund require to develop, stand up, and administer the small dollar loan program?
Let me comment again more broadly on CDFIs. As I've said, I acknowledge in many communities these have an impact, and if the committee wants to fund it, we will. Specifically in the case of the small dollar loan program, we actually think this is interesting because the grants from the small dollar program may be used for loan loss reserves and technical assistance in support of these products, and we look forward to working with this committee on administering that.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary. I want to follow up on an IRS issue. I believe it was yesterday, in response to my question from my colleague from California, Congresswoman Chu, that you testified, pardon me, that you directed IRS Commissioner Rettig to increase audits of high-income earners. And I applaud you for that, sir. It does appear that the IRS has been over-relying on auditing earned income tax credit returns. This is both inefficient and unfair, I believe. I have shared with both Commissioner Rettig and Inspector General George that targeting EITC returns has a disproportionate racial, ethnic, and tribal impact. It is discriminatory, to be blunt. I truly believe, Mr. Secretary, that neither you nor Commissioner Rettig nor the hardworking staff at the IRS intend for Black, Hispanic, and Native Americans to face audits at a higher rate. Unfortunately so. However, harmless intentions are not good enough to dismantle systems of racism. Imagine, for example, if a large bank instituted a policy of additional scrutiny for earned income tax credit borrowers. Agencies that report to you would be all over that bank, I presume. They would throw the book at them over equal credit and fair lending, and we'd all applaud you for it. How do you intend to ensure that Black, Hispanic, and Native Americans are not audited more often than white Americans?
Well, let me first say, as you cited, I have directed the commissioner on the audit rates of wealthy individuals because I was concerned with the reduction of resources and the reduction of that audit rate. And although I normally leave certain things to the commissioner, that was an issue that was important enough to me that I wanted to make sure there was no uncertainty in that.
Thank you.
As it relates to the EITCs, I mean, obviously we very much support EITCs. The reason why we audit EITCs at all is just because based upon the program, unfortunately, it is a program that is susceptible to fraud. I'm not aware of in any way that the IRS discriminates. Obviously, if they were doing that, that would be something would be very concerned. But I'm going to ask the commissioner to look into this and get back to me on it.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. When you joined us last spring, you encouraged Congress to work on a bipartisan basis to address a threat that cash-only markets pose to the safety of American people. For my constituents, that's Florida's voter-approved, licensed, regulated, and taxed medical marijuana industry, forced to operate in all cash because, as you frequently note, the discrepancy between federal and state laws exists. With this encouragement, the House passed the Safe Banking Act on an overwhelmingly bipartisan basis, 321 to 103. Thanks in large part to the leadership of nearly every member on this committee, led by our good chairman. That was in September. The Senate has yet to act on this bipartisan, common-sense legislation that would make families in my community and families all over the country be in a better place, in my opinion. Meanwhile, I'm hearing from financial institutions, large and small alike, that they still face uncertainty over whether they can provide financial services to legally operating marijuana businesses, or to businesses that serve marijuana businesses, or even a statewide candidate for agriculture commissioner running on a pro-medical marijuana platform in my state of Florida, which is exactly what happened to Commissioner Nikki Fried's campaign in Florida. She's the ag commissioner now. The financial institutions tell me it all depends on the examiner. While I am relieved that some at Treasury are taking a reasonable approach to this, and I hope it's because of your leadership, sir, but then with a wink and a nod, that's no way to regulate the world's premier financial system, which we are. At what point will you deem it appropriate to instruct regulators to take no action on banking legitimate medical marijuana businesses pending congressional action?
Let me say I'm not going to make a policy view, because it's not in my lane, on the issue of the conflict between state law and federal law and marijuana, and which it should be. So I am not equipped to do that. But what I will comment on, which is in my lane, is both from the IRS's standpoint, this creates a very large concern, and we have to build cash rooms to take in large amounts of cash where people owe us taxes because we want to collect the taxes, and those entities are not banked. And I would say that creates risk to our IRS employees and to the people in the community. I would also make the comment as it relates to bank regulators. FinCEN has issued certain guidance, but we do not have, we have limited abilities within this guidance to direct this issue. So again, I would encourage Congress one way or another, without me making a policy view of dealing with this issue. And the conflict is a problem. In which direction is resolved, I leave that to Congress and other experts.
If you could help us with the Senate, that would be wonderful. I have to stop. My time is way up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary.
Thank you. Mr. Amadeo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you again, Mr. Secretary. Just as a follow-up quickly to the Florida thing, and I get your answer and I respect it. It's kind of the only one available to you, maybe. But I find it incredibly ironic, we might as well make the record complete, that because of the conflict, the biggest money launderers for the marijuana industry, whether it's medical or recreational, depending on your state, and my state's both, is tax collectors. County tax collectors, state tax collectors, and federal tax. So it's like you got all this stuff about, well, we can't bank it. It's like, well, just, I mean, the irony is incredible that it's like, but the IRS will take cash, so give them all your cash. And when you say we got to have these rooms for all these mountains of cash, absolutely true. I just think it's an incredible irony that the biggest launderer of marijuana money, if your state's legalized it, quite frankly, are the tax collectors. And you're no different than the state or local ones. But so I guess we won't have a discussion about the Department of Justice today. But anyhow, I want to say thanks, because other than that, I don't have any questions, because I want to thank your liaison people. When we've had issues that relate to audit process and stuff like that over the last year, the reason I don't have a lot of questions is because your folks have been responsive and we have resolved the problems. Not that we've resolved the problems by telling your folks how to decide, but to say, follow your process. And for that, I want to publicly thank you. The second thing I want to do is say this. You've got an agency under you that kind of hides in plain sight, and that's the Mint folks. And so after being remiss in terms of trying to understand what they do, why they do it, how those things work, I had a chance to go up and see your folks in Philadelphia a few weeks ago. And I would recommend it to all members just as a curiosity thing. I mean, it's money, so that's interesting, but it's also, you know, the folks that do the paper stuff get all the whatever, but it's a fascinating thing. And quite frankly, I also want to say, I appreciate when my little corner of the world had an event for an outfit that used to be a Mint 150 years ago, that your Mint director showed up on his way back from some other duty to just be part of that. And that was a huge deal in that little corner of the world. So I want to publicly say thanks. I appreciate your LEDGE team's responsiveness and professionalism, and I might go harass your other Mints too, haven't seen that, to compare them to the original Mint. So thank you very much, appreciate it, pleasure to work with your folks. I yield back.
Well, thank you for your compliments on our LEDGE team, and let me just offer to you and the rest of the committee that if any of you want a special tour of any of the mints or the Bureau of Engraving, here or others, we're happy to arrange that. And thank you for the acknowledgement in the Mint. They tend to get underrepresented, but they do a great job.
Yeah, they do. And Mr. Chairman, I should say to the members of the committee, they do have a rule. When you go in for the tour, you know, they make you empty your pockets and whatever. The one rule that they have that applies to everybody, including the director, is nobody leaves the Mint with any change. So I guess that's that security thing or whatever the heck, but I got over it quick enough. And
We appreciate your public service.
Yeah, that's it.
Reminder,
That's right.
sir.
That's it.
Thank you. Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Secretary Mnuchin, for being here. We really appreciate it. I'm going to give you some softballs. I know that I just want to follow up on 4 things that I've asked the last time you were here. 2 local issues. The Los Angeles County Fair Association, LA County Fairplex, is in my district, in my home city. I've been very disappointed at the fact that they have abused their tax-exempt status in addition to straying from its mission of horticultural enhancement. There were 2 audits that were done, one by the state, one by the local county, which revealed grossly incompetence, payments of over millions of dollars to its CEO and its top 3 administrators. Without objection, I would like to submit both audits, the county audit and the state audit, for the record, as well as a letter that I sent to the IRS in 2016 asking for you to look into it. I know that there were folks that followed up with the Fairplex and asked them to clean up their act a bit. I don't know what other additional follow-up has been done. I don't know if you even have enough resources to ensure that organizations like this don't continue to abuse their powers. Lack of paying, taxes into a community is something that we should all be concerned about. The other issue is the administration raided $601 million from Treasury forfeiture fund to help President Trump build his wall. These are critical funds that our police departments depend on to fight against gangs, drug cartels, Mexican mafia in my district, and to help children in the community grow in a good environment. The funding was diverted last year. What efforts, are there going to be any efforts this year to divert more of that funding that is critical to our communities?
On the first comment to the LA County Fair, I can't comment on any specific
We can follow up on
taxpayer
that.
issues. But let me just say, anytime there is an issue of taxpayer things like you've done, I appreciate you bringing it to our and the IRS's attention very much. In regards to the forfeiture fund, I think there's been no plans for 2020 at this point, one way or
Thank
another.
you. On the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, I passed two amendments. One that tasks the State Department to create a list of corrupt elected officials. Unfortunately, the State Department came up with a list that I could have Googled and created myself, as most of those folks had already been prosecuted and incarcerated. I'm very concerned as to what's happening in the Northern Triangle, as we see thousands of more children, very tender age children, and their moms or families coming north and waiting on our southern border. I want to make sure that your office is working diligently to ensure that we are holding the corrupt elected officials in the Northern Triangle accountable. Honduras, we have a narco government. We have a president that, whose family is involved. He himself has taken a lot of money from the drug cartels, yet the administration continues to cozy up to them, to this administration in Honduras. In Guatemala, because of our failure to act, the former president, Jimmy Morales, threw out of the country CICIG, which is the UN's investigation commission that was there. Moxie has been thrown out of Honduras. So are we really serious about dealing with corrupt elected officials? And are we doing everything that we can to ensure that we are imposing the Magnitsky Act against these corrupt elected officials that have been now named on this list?
Well, let me first say we obviously are very much focused on corrupt officials, and we work closely with the State Department on the global Magnitsky sanctions, which we think are a very ongoing, important situation. I don't want to publicly comment on any of the specifics that you've described, but we will continue to work with your office, and we very much share your concern about corruption.
I want to know what steps we're taking to ensure that we are following up on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Joyce,
Thank you, Chairman Quigley. I appreciate the opportunity.
is this number 3 for the day?
2 at the moment,
2,
thank
all
you.
right.
Secretary Mnuchin, thank you for being here today. And I understand that my colleague, Mr. Chris, may have gone down some of this road with you before on cannabis banking, but it was... Well, last year I started that discussion, and I would like to continue it if we could. I know the Safe Banking Act, which was something I supported, was, I thought, a step in the right direction when it comes to eliminating the inefficiencies I see between the state, for the Treasury and state legal cannabis businesses alike. However, in my opinion, there's so much work that still needs to be done. Can we count on a member of your staff of keeping the committee apprised of the challenges Treasury and IRS face in this area? Because I think it's important Congress continue to iron out these problems as they are an issue of public safety, transparency, and accountability.
Well, I'll repeat my comments only because I do think this is an important issue. First, as I said earlier, I'm not making a policy view on this because that's not in my lane as to the conflict between state law and federal law. Right. What I would say is in my lane, and again, I'll repeat this because I think it's important, this creates significant problems for the IRS. We have to build cash rooms where we have to take in cash because many of these entities are not banked. That creates significant risk in the communities for collecting this amount of cash and is problematic. And I would also say from the standpoint of the bank regulators, although we issue certain guidance in FinCEN, there is this conflict between state and federal law creates significant issues for financial institutions. So I would encourage Congress to deal with this one way or another without me making a comment. This is now an industry that is growing, that has a lot of cash, and as one of your colleagues made the comment, if this were somewhere else in the world with all this cash, we'd have a very different view of it.
You're not getting off that easy, sir. No, obviously there's a lot of conflicts that are presented here, and something that I got up and put in an amendment in a full committee hearing one time, and things didn't go so well for me, and the next day I heard you on TV explaining all the problems that you're having there with this issue, and boy, I wish I could have had you on TV during this hearing when I had my hat handed to me, but you know, it is something that needs to be rectified, and I understand that the safe cash rooms and things like that. I mean, there's a old bank robber from Cleveland named Willie Sutton, and after he got caught for the 9th time, they asked him, you know, why he continued to rob banks. He said, because that was where the money is. And when you create this situation, I'm surprised that, you know, there isn't more danger, unfortunately, to the public in having these large amounts of cash being kept. It should be in the institutions that small banks, community banks, state-run banks, so they can do what they do best, is let this burn into the community and finance other small businesses and other things. But there has to be, I realize it's our problem, and I realize it's something we need to address. But in the meantime, some help from the Treasury as to why it's important to get these things taken care of sooner rather than later, because these are legitimate going concerns that under the, you know, enacted by a state in which the state, whether we like it or not, has made it legal in some way, shape, or form, be it full legal, medical, or CBD. I'm still not sure what the hell that is, but there seems to be CBD everywhere as well. You know, we really need to have this addressed, and so we were looking for some guidance from your working with your department to try to come to some understanding, because one of the things you hear get thrown around are, oh, it's just going to allow cartels to launder their money. Now, wouldn't you agree that if, in fact, we had, as my distinguished colleague, Mr. Amity, has brought up what they have in Nevada, where it's all hands are up, you treat it like casinos, all the revenue, since they do it now, monitored from seed to sale, in most states, they dictate how much you can sell it for, that all the pricing would be in there. You'd know what the profits are, and if we had an all-of-above approach, it'd be easier to collect the taxes on it, and it would be easier to show everybody just, you know, how the regulation actually works, and it wouldn't allow for allegedly cartels to launder their money. Wouldn't that make sense to you?
Again, I'm acknowledging that this creates problems for us and should be addressed. Without legislation, we have limitations in what we can do on this issue. There is a conflict between federal and state law, and we don't have the ability at Treasury to fix that conflict. So as long as that conflict exists, this is a business that generates lots of cash, and obviously that creates concerns for us, both in our standpoint of money laundering and our standpoint of just the IRS and collecting it.
One last one, if I could. Would the issue, since it's all cash business now, right? The financing of the companies have to be business. You know, there needs to be some common sense brought to those tier 2 and tier 3 people, the people who like built a building that they're going to harvest or grow the cannabis in, and those type of things, and having their finances questioned because they happen to receive payment for a transaction that has nothing to do with the growing of cannabis other than building the facility or something else. I mean, we need to have some sense brought to that so people's lines of credit in legitimate businesses such as, say, Scott's Fertilizer in Ohio, which doesn't grow a thing but manages to sell into the industry, somehow has an issue with their lines of credit when they're not doing anything wrong. And that's where we need some help and some guidance as well, sir. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, let me ask you about the Tax Act. I think recently and I want to make sure I got it right, you suggested that you still believe that this will pay for itself within the next 10 years. When this was being proposed and shortly thereafter, Tax Institute, Goldman, others said that their projections, even with other spending taken into consideration in government, about a $1.5 trillion addition to our debt. The Congressional Budget Office has said it'll add $1.9 trillion. And recently, other institutions, Tax Policy Center, Tax Foundation, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, and Center for a Responsible Budget all say that tax reform is not deficit neutral. Their numbers are all over a 10-year period, regardless of the other spending, taking it outside the other spending, non-defense and defense and so forth, is around $1.9 trillion addition to the debt. Your response, the insight you have that these institutions and the CBO doesn't have as to why you disagree with such a wide-ranging number?
Well, here's the good news. This is just math. And ultimately, 8 years from now, and I say 8 years because we're 2 years in, okay, it will be very clear what these numbers are. I think that for the first 2 years, we're right on our internal projections. Every year we go by, we will have more certainty. So yes, I stand behind my projection. This is just math. If we increase the growth rate by a certain amount, that will generate more revenues, which will pay for the tax cuts. But as I said, I look forward to coming back to this committee down the road.
Have you analyzed the analysis of CBO and
We have.
all these other
We have.
institutions?
It's relatively simple. It's just
How
a
are they
difference.
wrong and you were right?
Again, it's math. So
I get,
based
I get
upon
math, but which math?
depending on what you think the growth rate will be, what the addition of
it's-
growth is.
And I respect that. You're just saying that it's all the difference in growth rate.
Absolutely.
Nothing to do with the loss in other revenues.
No. So, I mean, as you said, let's put aside spending. I've never said, in other words, we increase spending
Well,
and
they
we
took
did
it into
tax cuts.
consideration, obviously.
Well, again, what I've said, I just want to be clear.
Yeah.
I've always said the Tax Act will pay for the tax cuts, okay? There was additional spending increases as a result of both military spending and non-military spending that had nothing to do with the tax cuts. So when people talk about the current deficit, let me just make the comment that a huge component of the current deficit is additional spending. The other part of the current deficit is focused on when we calculate the tax cuts over the 10 years, we've always said that the incentives were there are tax cuts in the first 5 years and then significant additions in tax revenues in the next 5 years. So again, I would just say it's not a question of I'm right and someone else is wrong. Time will tell. If indeed we get the growth that I think we will get, this will more than pay for itself.
Obviously, extraordinary room for disagreement on something of extraordinary quality and nature. Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, if I could circle back around to some of the cybersecurity conversation we were having a minute ago. I brought up the sanctions on North Korea, and I don't think I asked the question, are they still being enforced today, those sanctions? Are you familiar if they are?
I mean, we have churned out, as you know, a large number of sanctions on North Korea that really have been focused on their nuclear weapons programs. I'm not familiar with the Sony sanctions. I'm more than happy to go back and look at them and let you know. I know there have been some other sanctions on North Korea associated with cyber crimes that they've done, or not against them, on actors in North Korea. Let me be more specific. But I'm happy to get back to you specifically on the Sony sanctions. I don't know what the impact was.
And the reason I ask is really just trying to get my head around the policy of sanctions as it relates to cyber. You know, how long will they be imposed if they are? And when do you choose not to? You know, and I know this is policy from the previous administration, which sort of leads me to the next thought is that it was recently identified that China was responsible for, and people were indicted in China for the recent hacks here as well. And yet I don't think sanctions were imposed in that case. Where do you draw that red line of when sanctions should be imposed, and or is it really not an effective response when a foreign sponsored entity attacks one of our companies?
I broadly think sanctions are very, very effective. So as a broad statement, targeted sanctions are very effective. As it relates to the specifics, we do coordinate with DOJ. There are times that we do things together. There are times we do things where there are sanctions and not indictments. The standards are different. So there'll be policy times when we decide to do them together. There'll be policy times where we do sanctions and don't do indictments, and the other way around.
It seems, I guess, when I feel like China might have been accused for the opium breach that occurred with 23 million, records of federal employees, as well as maybe Equifax and others. So I'm trying to find out where that red line is, and I think that's difficult, and I think we're all struggling with identifying how do we respond to some of these, and which sort of leads me to the next thought, and that is earlier this year when the strike on General Soleimani occurred, it was thought that Iran may attempt to attack our business sectors through cyber means, and typically when that happens, it's going to be energy or healthcare or the financial sectors. Are you aware of any of our sectors currently being targeted by Iran, and if so, what would our response be if they were successful?
If I were aware, it would be because of classified information that I have, so I'm not going to comment on whether I am aware or not aware, so I don't want you to take that answer in this setting. What I will tell you is a broad comment of if we are aware on a classified basis of specific attacks that are going to occur, we do every effort we can to work with the private sector or protect the U.S. interests.
Okay, thank you. And then my last question, Mr. Chairman, is just, I know you're doing a lot of work with the financial sector as it relates to cybersecurity and the various threats they may face. Recently, the Department of Defense put out basically a memorandum suggesting that if third-party contractors were going to engage with the Department of Defense, they had to meet certain standards. They're beginning to lay out guidelines of how they must protect their, the third parties must, the contractors must protect their systems. Or anything like that being considered for other sectors that interface with the government or are critical to our economy?
Well, absolutely. So the good thing about the financial sector is they are way ahead of everybody else on cybersecurity. Part of the reason why they're way ahead is because they have traditionally had a disproportionate number of attacks, and they've invested early. As someone said, you follow the money. I will comment that, as it relates to our systems internally, particularly our classified systems, there are very specific requirements as regards to anybody that can connect in to those systems. We look very carefully to the points of failure where there are connections between these systems, and without going through all the details in this, it's something that I have reviewed internally. Given my technology background, I'm particularly interested in this, and I've also had discussions on a broader basis on the national security issues associated with this.
And you're absolutely right about the financial sector. Is there a minimum set of standards they universally go by, or is it just they're just good at what they do and they have a lot of interest?
No, if you're a regulated entity, which almost, if we were talking about a bank, by definition you are subject to examinations and standards as determined by your bank regulator. So whether it's the OCC or it's the FDIC or it's the state regulator or the Fed from a holding company standpoint, absolutely. Matter of fact, one of the things we've worked with the financial sectors, particularly the big banks, is typically they're being audited by 4 of the regulators. And one of the things we've tried to do is coordinate that oversight, because a lot of times you have the Fed, you have the FDIC, you have the OCC all going in, and we're trying to get them to pool their resources.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And when I was speaking of standards, I was really focusing on cyber security, defensive.
And I'm referring to specifically cybersecurity audits. So there are specific in the internal technology standards, cybersecurity, doing audits of external threats. That's all within the banking regulator's purview and a big focus.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Again, Secretary Mnuchin, thank you for being here. I understand in talking to my distinguished colleague, Mr. Amadei, that he might have asked you some of those questions. As you know, we're in a bunch of these different, we're hopping from committee to committee. I apologize if I because I could never articulate the question as clearly as Mr. Amadei would have, so I'm sure that was very forceful. But I'm looking for help, because I think that you're a learned man in the financial institutions who would be able to bring some common sense to this whole program, because it doesn't make any sense to me now. But moving on from that, something you inherited with the hardest hit funds, which were used I think they were brought up during the TARP program, that were used in the stabilized neighborhoods and that were economically blighted or became a problem. And while we're well removed from that housing crisis that triggered TARP, this hardest hit fund, can you provide some feedback in the value of the hardest hit fund program so Congress can consider similar measures to stabilize housing prices in blighted areas moving forward?
As you said, the hardest hit funds were really part of the financial crisis and predated me in this capacity. By the time we got here, most of these funds had wound down to a large extent. I think in certain cases it's been very effective, and in certain cases it's been subject to audits and things like that, less so. So I think, fortunately, we're not in a housing crisis anymore, but I think it had mixed views across the board.
Well, in Ohio, luckily, we saw some great progress made with Western Reserve Land Conservancy and have spent all of our money, and really you can see the bang for the buck when you go around to neighborhoods. I understand other states may not have spent all that they were entitled to or all that they were allotted. Does the Treasury have any ability to, I know the numbers were already set before you got there and all, but is there a way to massage those around to those who have been doing it effectively, could continue to use that money in an appropriate manner to continue to stabilize neighborhoods?
Yeah.
And
My understanding is that without legislation, we can't reallocate the money, but if the committee decided they wanted us to reallocate the money, subject to making sure that communities like you've referenced, it's used effectively, we would not object to that.
Great. And thanks again for your time here, sir. Appreciate your leadership.
Final thoughts to the rank. Thank you. Final thoughts from the ranking member. Before we conclude, I want to ask unanimous consent to add a letter from the Credit Union National Association addressed to myself and the ranking member to the record. No objections. Thank you. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today. We look forward to working with you as time goes on.